In Genesis chapter 21 today, in Genesis chapter 21. In Genesis chapter 21, it seems to me there are three main events that are described within the confines of the text. The first is the birth of Isaac. This great verse, it starts out in verse 1. Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. After the birth of Sarah, it seems like the animosity between Hagar and Sarah and their children grew. Sarah seemed to look at Hagar and be reminded of her mistakes and the threat that Hagar's child would pose to Isaac and his descendants. So she wanted Abraham to drive Hagar and the child away. Even though this distressed Abraham was reassured by the Lord that Isaac would be his heir and that he would also take care of his son Ishmael through Hagar. And that's what we have transposed really in verses 15 through 21. Even in the midst of distress, God sees the needs of Hagar and Ishmael and responds to them. The last section of chapter 21 is the covenant that is made with Abimelech. And much of this covenant kind of ties around the idea that they now name this place where this well is dug, Beersheba, that's going to play a prominent role in Israel's history in the days ahead. So guys, what do y'all see in the text?
I want to think about a couple things from the first few verses here. Verse 1 is really interesting. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. What this text, I think, tells us is that God keeps his promises, which is impressive, but he keeps it in the details. He is referring back a couple of chapters when he said, I'm going to visit you in a year, and this is what's going to happen. That's exactly what Jesus does, or God does, and so he keeps his promises even in the details. But then I wanted to notice what Abraham's response to God keeping that promise is. In verse 4, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 years old, as God had commanded him. And so Abraham's response to God keeping his promises, I'm going to obey what you said. And bringing that into our day, God has made promises to us. I think we can look at Scripture and know that God's going to keep his promises even in the details. And that requires a response from us. We need to have the faith and the obedience that Abraham shows here.
Yeah. And like Austin, I've struggled with two different lessons, and I decided just to bring them both up. The first one I think is a great, wonderful lesson on marriage. If you look at verse 12, when Sarah is not happy with Hagar and Ishmael being there, we are told, in verse 11, that Abraham was upset about this. But in verse 12, God said to Abraham, do not be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. Too many times in marriages, husbands and wives start fighting against one another. They think, well, it shouldn't be like this, so I'm going to resist you. I think there's a great lesson here for the husband toward his wife. Sometimes, even if you disagree with her, satisfy her. Do what pleases her. And I think the same thing would be true for a wife toward her husband. Stop fighting with each other. Just do what pleases them. And marriages would be so much better off with one another if we just focused on pleasing the other person. And the second one is in this whole story of Ishmael and Hagar, and they go off, and Ishmael is seemingly dying of thirst. God speaks there to Hagar, and we are told this in verse 17. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. I think that's a wonderful phrase. God heard the voice of the boy where he is. What an important thing for you and I to understand in every situation in life, as difficult as it may be, God hears us where we are. If you're hurting, God hears you. If you're happy, God hears you. If life is overwhelming you, God hears you. We're never at a point where God can't hear us where we are. Think about that as you go through the weekend.
Great applications, guys. Thank you all for joining us all the week as we've been in the book of Genesis. We'll pick back up there on Tuesday. If you have any comments about this chapter, or you see anything in this chapter that would help us, please drop it in the comments below, and you all have a great weekend.